Hello, and welcome to another reading diary on the channel. This time, episode 2 for Infinite Jest. The last one of these videos that I did came out right about a month ago or so, covering the first 11 chapters of the book, which I believe was like the first 12%. Now I am currently right around the 40% mark, if I am not mistaken, or rather, if I am remembering correctly. And that is the point that I've gotten to. I've read through chapter 22 of the book. And again, for those of you who don't know, the technical chapters that I'm running off of is whenever the book appears with one of these like sort of eclipse looking circles. That's what I'm delineating as a full chapter. So there's 28 chapters in the book. I've read now the first 22 of them, which is kind of scary to think about because I still have that much of the book left. Like, you know, not quite 2/3, but may as well be 2/3 of the book left, and there's only 6 chapters remaining, because the last 2 chapters, maybe even the last 3 chapters, are like half the book, just straight up. So, you know, we'll see how things go in future diaries for the book. But as for the spoiler free for this video, talking about my experience over the last month or so reading Infinite Jest, well, let's kind of wrap up a little bit of how things went in the first diary. My first couple weeks reading the book went very smoothly, at least very much smoother than I thought they were going to be. Basically every aspect. I thought it was easier to read, more sensible than I thought it was going to be, and had a lot of really great material, and wasn't like super dense, wasn't overly dense, I would say. Comparatively, the next few weeks of reading, because I only read for about 3 of the last 4 weeks, were a little bit more rough, we'll say. What was good was still absolutely great, and I still really liked it. Although nothing, I would say, hit quite as hard as some of those earlier chapters, like the weed addict chapter, which was chapter 2, and then the psychiatric patient section was another one that stood out, which I think was in chapter 5, if I'm not mistaken. But, you know, what was good was still great here, regardless, but there was also a lot of brain busting stuff that, you know, led to a lot of hurt in my head, where there were plenty of sections that were a lot more dense. There were some that seemed a little bit more irrelevant. There were some that kind of dragged on a little bit over long. I remember noting that there were several chapters during my reading over the past month where the half of it was like incredible, but the other half dragged a little bit and really exhausted me. So the book has been a little bit tougher to read over the last week, but I think I'm coming out of that, actually. So is Infinite Jest still frying my brain, or am I getting the hang of it? The irony is that I actually didn't feel like it was really frying my brain in the first diary, but it started to fry my brain this time. But like I said, I think I am coming out of it. I've largely enjoyed the book so far. Like I said, there's been a few things that have been going on that are of particular note, like the major plot lines. We'll say the Marathon Steepley plot line has been intriguing. There wasn't much of it in the last month's worth of reading compared to, you know, before, where chapter 11 had a lot of that material. Maybe 12, because I'm forgetting exactly which chapter I finished in the first diary. You'll know if you see that video. The Tennis Academy stuff was all fantastic. Super loving a lot of that stuff. More specifically, phone calls between Hal and Oren has been fantastic in the reading for the month. And I've been really digging some of the Ennett House, you know, Alcoholics Anonymous type stuff now. Some of it is a bit much. Absolutely, plenty of it runs over long. You know, often very long-winded in ways that may or may not actually benefit the plot line. Stuff that I don't dislike, but it does take a long time to read. Reading the book has still been kind of a joy, even though it has been a little bit more rough over the last month, but I am still basically where I want to be. Being 40% into the book, despite taking a week off over vacation the last week, means that I'm basically sitting where I want to be, and that future diary should absolutely come out on time, and I should finish the book on schedule, if not before I'm due to finish it, which is really exciting. That's what I'm really looking forward to. But with that being said, this diary might be slightly more rough than the last one was, just because it has been about almost 2 weeks since I've read anything in the book, so it's been a minute since I've been in this world, been with these characters or anything like that. So even with the notes that I have in this video, there might be stuff that, you know, makes me sound like an absolute total lunatic, which is something that's pretty normal at this point for my channel anyway, but I'll try not to sound too much more like one than I need to. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about this. So without further ado, because I know that this video is going to be really long based on how long the first one of these videos was, let's start off with the actual spoilers. So if you have not read through about 40% of the book, read through the first 22 chapters, I recommend clicking out now and experiencing that for yourself and coming back later if you're interested. But I will be starting off now with chapter 12, which I'll tell you what was a really horrible way to start off my reading for this diary, because yeah, chapter 12 was absolutely mind-boggling. It was not fun. Like I said, horrible way to start the diary, horrible way to start off my reading after enjoying so much before that. Chapter 11 was dense and pretty hard to get through, what with all the wheelchair assassin stuff and the AFR and footnote 304, or endnote rather, 304. It was a lot. Chapter 11 was a lot, but like 12 was a lot. We got the introduction of what people consider the yours truly section, because yours truly appears as like a combined word like a million times during the section. The main memorable thing about chapter 12, and memorable, take that lightly, is that the prose was extremely hard to read. I feel like I should have reread the yours truly section, but I was absolutely not going to do that because it hurt my brain and I was not going to waste the time doing that. 60 minutes or so to read like 7 pages was absolute absurdity, and that is all that I remember reading from chapter 12. I'm sure there was more material in that chapter that I just didn't note because my mind was too broken from the yours truly section, but like, that's all I know. Yours truly section was terrible. It was hard to read. It was rough. There was some stuff in there that like I kind of maybe understood, question mark, but like not enough to actually talk about here. I'll see how maybe it is relevant later, because whenever stuff is referenced in that kind of way, I do tend to remember stuff. Maybe, we'll see. Chapter 13 did go a decent bit better, however. It was one of many phone calls during this reading over the past month between Hal and Oren, as said before, which this phone call specifically hinted a little bit at stuff like separatism, the political ideas that are being explored in the book, most especially Canadian separatism. The details of what actually was discussed in the chapter are a bit jumbled, but there was plenty of interesting material in there. Stuff that hints at the Marathon Steepley plot line, given some lists found within chapter 13 of like anti-Onan terrorist organizations and stuff like that. So the kind of material that the Marathon Steepley plotline is all about. There was also a short essay written by Hal in chapter 13 on something that I don't remember the topic of what it was. I could try to go in and find it, but because the chapters are not delineated very well, it would be a pain in the butt to find it. I remember liking the essay, even though I don't remember right now what it was about. So that's kind of how things go sometimes. And there was also some funny short stuff in chapter 13 about stealing a woman's artificial heart, which may or may not relate to the yours truly mind-boggling section from chapter 12 because of very specific references found within it. But because I understood that yours truly section so little, I'm not confident in making that suggestion at all. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, maybe it's just something completely unrelated. But yeah, the portion of this gang of people stealing a woman's artificial heart because it's in her purse, and they stole her purse, and the absurdity of that was kind of funny. It was goofy, but I thought it was enjoyable, and I know it actually comes up in little bits and pieces later. In fact, there's one that we're going to talk about slightly, just briefly, a little bit later. But yeah, that was what happened in chapter 13. Chapter 14 was a little bit of unrelated stuff, or seemingly irrelevant material. I mean, it's not like irrelevant, it still applies to the story, but something that like maybe you didn't need to have it, but I really enjoyed reading it nonetheless. It was tennis academy stuff. So Enfield Tennis Academy, relating to piss tests, with the characters taking urine tests and what many of them do, because a lot of these students take drugs or do other things that would render them ineligible to participate in competition in the sporting, in tennis with other people, but ways that certain students get around these urine tests, the way that they're able to avoid the consequences of doing drugs and whatnot. So, it was an interesting section. Like I said, it was kind of dry in a sense, the way that it was told, but it was inherently interesting to me for reasons that I wish I knew and understood. So that was most of what chapter 14 was about. Chapter 15 starts with a monologuing of Hal's and Oren's grandfather to their father as a child. So it actually goes back in time to like 1960, the year 1960 or so, with, multi-page paragraph, just ramblings from, like I said, it's Hal's and Oren's grandfather. So it's James Oren Incandenza's father ranting to him as a child, feverish rantings about James's potential, or J.O.'s potential as a tennis player. And I'm going to refer to James Oren Incandenza, Hal and Oren, and Mario's father as J.O. throughout these diaries, I think, just to make things a little bit easier on me. Feverish ranting, this monologuing had about J.O.'s potential with tennis. There was some other random stuff in that monologue as well that I don't rightly recall. It was, like I said, rather feverish and kind of crazy. It was hard to really put together, the importance of it. There was a lot of stuff relating to cars and bodies and how that relates to cars. And it was a whole thing. It was kind of weird and wacky and crazy, but I enjoyed it. But there was a lot just that flew over my head during that section. There was also a portion of chapter 15 that contained a segment of some film that Mario is producing, kind of following after J.O.'s footsteps. This film features, or rather stars, I guess, Hal narrating something that seems unrelated. I feel like I remember it being political, maybe having some familial stuff in there. I don't rightly recall, I don't remember what Hal's essay from before was about. I don't remember what this monologuing was in this example film that Mario's doing, but there was stuff, and I enjoyed reading that section, that's for sure. And I also believe chapter 15 is when we got a brief early glimpse, maybe one of our earliest glimpses, if not the first glimpse, of the Ennet House stuff happening. So the Alcoholics Anonymous plot line, I guess we'll say. It wasn't exactly clear at this point yet what that material was, but we did get a glimpse at it, and makes a little bit more sense in hindsight as far as that's concerned. Chapter 16, however, was really exciting for me, because within the first 5 pages or so, we actually get a really big revelation as to what the timeline is all about. Because the Infinite Jest uses all these headings as stuff like Year of the Dependable Undergarment, which is a good example, because this is the year, the subsidized year, that most of the book up to this point, and I think the vast majority of the book just in general, takes place in. So there's other stuff that seems to be earlier, some stuff even within the years, not linear, stuff happens earlier in that year, some happens later in that year. But this year of the Dependable Undergarment, which is when most of the book takes place, is revealed to be within chapter 16, 12 years after the MIT language riots, which was something that I remembered about reading in an endnote from earlier in the book, chapter 8's endnote. So the James Oren Incandenza, the J.O. filmography endnote, lists one of the films as perhaps being an inciting incident of sorts for those MIT language riots, but it does list in one of those notes, and then notes, I actually went and found the filmography endnote again and tried to find this reference, because I remembered there being a reference. The MIT language riots happened in 1997, so if Year of the Dependable Undergarment takes place 12 years after the MIT language riots, that would make this year 2009. So the majority of the book takes place in 2009, and it seems like, even with bouncing around within the year with most of the stuff that takes place in this year, basically all the other scenes that haven't taken place in 2009 seem to take place earlier. So I'm assuming that Year of the Dependable Undergarment at this point takes place at the very end of the timeline, essentially. There was only one scene, one chapter that I felt could definitively be said to take place later. I think that was the very first chapter. But yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about timeline stuff a little bit later. I was just excited because chapter 16, in the first 5 or so pages, actually revealed some important information about the timeline, which gave us that, the primary year of the book, when most of it takes place, is 2009. So that was really cool. Beyond that revelation, however, there was also some interesting, albeit strange, radio broadcast stuff of Madame Psychosis, stuff that like wasn't entirely clear. We get to see her through a couple of different POVs, one of those being a sound engineer in the booth with her doing one of these radio shows of her, and then also switching back and forth between that and Mario, listening from a radio or something like that within the headmaster's house at the Enfield Tennis Academy, where he listens, because the headmaster's house is where Avril, or the family's mother, resides. I think the uncle resides there too, Uncle Charles. I might be misremembering that detail, but pretty sure that's how things go. Either way, we do get to see this job that Madame Psychosis has in the wake of having starred in a lot of film stuff for J.O. I guess this radio show is kind of like her career, and audiences seem to really love it for one reason or another, especially Mario, whom we get to see the radio show through perspective at times. We also learn later in the chapter, though, that Madame Psychosis had relations at one point or another with Orin, and I'm predicting that she at some point does work for Mario's filmography, the way that she did for J.O. I don't know if that's going to be what happens or not later in the book, but like maybe that'll happen, because it seems the book might center a little bit not just on the Maris Steepley plotline, but also on the Alcoholics Anonymous plotline, which we'll get to in just a little bit as far as this is concerned, but also like a film that a film that Mario is producing. Maybe I'm totally wrong on this, but like I feel like there's a chance that we'll see Madame Psychosis in some of Mario's stuff later. That like it just seems a little bit too pointed for there to be an obsession there and not to utilize it, but maybe that's just me, like I said before. But speaking of Ennet House stuff, next up we got a scene in this chapter, a great section on Ennet House going over how addiction and recovery affect people's outlook and understanding of life. I found that section to be rather enlightening, although there was an odd section within it that was about tattoos and about how like the main POV, the main character of this Ennet House plotline, analyzes owners based off of some of their tattoo history and stuff like that, which was really kind of goofy and funny, but I thought it was enjoyable nonetheless. And then we had a small section at the end of the chapter that took us back to Enfield Tennis Academy, with Pemulus having acquired some DMZ, with which he makes plans to test out with Hal and Axford following a tennis competition with Port Washington Tennis Academy, which again we'll talk about a little bit later. But that was chapter 16, so there was plenty of material there. Chapter 17 was really interesting because we got the real identity of Madame Psychosis within it, which I found really shocking. I was not expecting to get this character's identity like at all. I figured this was going to be like one of the mysteries of the book. Turns out it's not. Her name is Joelle Van Dyne. We get to get a deep look at her personal mental state within this chapter. We get a look at what her relationship was like to some degree, or at least briefly in some sense, with J.O. We get to see how complicated that was given her prevalence in his work, yet there not really being like a fully romantic relationship there. Like it wasn't like J.O. was doing anything with her because he was married to Avril, but like she or Joelle, Madame Psychosis, thought there should have been something more, or maybe there was something more, like a complicated relationship type of thing, a situationship, if you will, forgive my Zoomer language. Near the end of this little plot with Madame Psychosis in this chapter, our plot continues in the bathroom of a party she's attending, where we see her attempt to OD on cocaine in an attempt to off herself, and also get to see a lot of little hints at the Ultimate Infinite Jest film, plus other reference to, James Oren and Cadenza's work. All of this material worked brilliantly. I thought it was all really good. The hints at specific stuff that like has us wondering about how certain aspects of different plot lines line up, and how certain different characters' relationships are affected, and how they interact and to what degree. A lot of this material I found to be really interesting. Also, one of the other major things chapter 17 did was gave us the chronology of years within the book, and that is one that I have bookmarked right here. So I was right that Year of the Dependable Undergarment, aka 2009, is basically at the end. The very first chapter was from the Year of Glad. It's the only chapter that has taken place in that year so far in the book. So these are at the end of the timeline. So Year of Glad is 2010, and then you work backwards all the way to Year of the Whopper being 2002. So having that in there was really nice. The timeline is 100% confirmed, which makes following the back and forth, the jumping between the timeline and different scenes, even within the same year, really interesting, trying to piece together how certain things interact and all of that fun stuff. Finally, we also got some reference to the career of one character named Helen Steepley, relating obviously to the Meredith Steepley plotline in some way, shape, or form, who I'm assuming Helen is that Steepley's wife. How this relates to the overall story is to be determined, even where I am currently at after chapter 22, but I am certainly interested in seeing more of it. The next couple chapters had a lot of fantastic material. Chapter 18 was another call between Oren and Hal, with back and forth bantering that I found really, really amazing. Hal talks about his experience primarily finding his father, James Oren, in Cadenza after his own self-offing with a microwave, which, gave some insight on how that worked with him in ways that, I'm not sure I needed that detail, but I wanted that detail because I wasn't sure how someone offs themselves using a microwave, closing their head in a microwave. So, giving an explanation for that was entertaining, if kind of depressing in some way. And then we also get a little bit of talking between Hal and Oren about Oren's association with an unknown Helen character, who I'm assuming at this point is probably Steepley. I don't think there's been a firm confirmation of that, but things have just been fitting together well enough that I'm pretty sure I can confirm that that's Helen Steepley that he is talking to. But that was chapter 18. There wasn't a whole lot of information there. I just thought that the phone call was amazing. All of the phone calls between Oren and Hal have been amazing. I guess there's been the two that I don't really remember much of, but the ones that I do remember have been fantastic. Some of my favorite material in the book for sure. Chapter 19 goes back to the Enfield Tennis Academy stuff. Specifically, the first half of this was the Port Washington versus Enfield tennis matchup. So this whole section was fantastic. I kind of wish that the whole chapter was this scene and that the scene was longer and had more stuff to it. The small bits that we got from Hal's and John Wayne's matches as the top two ranking players at Enfield was really entertaining. I also liked the more personal bits from Pemulus and a character whose name I'm not going to pronounce right now. I specifically looked up how to pronounce it yesterday because I didn't want to absolutely butcher it in the video, but I'm going to butcher it right now if I don't look it up. It seems his name might be pronounced Schacht or something like that. I think it's a German name, so forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Probably terrible. I'm sorry for butchering names, but getting personal bits from that character and Pemulus was fun as well. Plus, this was something that I definitely noted. There was a brief little bit of Mario framing potential film or documentary style stuff there in this little Enfield versus Port Washington match as well that seemed a little out of place, but also is just kind of fun once we see a revelation about Mario later, which we'll talk about, I believe, in a couple chapters if I'm not mistaken. The second half of chapter 19 was pretty dry. It was a lot of Ennet House stuff. There's big, Alcoholics Anonymous group conglomerate, or, with a bunch of other definitions of what other different similar types of groups there are, and having some of that whatnot. Like I said, it was pretty dry stuff. I don't really remember any of the details from this portion of the chapter. It kind of slowed down my speed after I enjoyed the Enfield v Port Washington match so much, but it was what it was. Chapter 20 was a little bit more of a flashback style chapter. I don't remember for sure if it actually took place in an earlier year. I'm pretty sure it did, because it talks mostly about Oren and his history. Most notably, the fact that he was a good tennis player, in that he was, a ranking player within Enfield, but wasn't good enough to be, a national player, wasn't good enough to be in the big leagues, for example. So he was considered a mediocre tennis player, comparatively speaking, at ETA, and went to Boston University instead of going straight to the big leagues. It talks about how at Boston University, Oren switched to football and became a kicker while he was there. Talks about how he met a character named Joel, the very same Joel Van Dyne as we know. It strikes up some sort of friendship / relationship with her. We see a little bit of Joel's film hobbyisms as it pertains to James, Oren, and Cadenza as well within the chapter. This whole section of Oren's history was perhaps a little long-winded, I confess. Like, maybe it was, but it was really fun nonetheless. Like, it was all interesting material that I don't think any of it should have been cut. So I enjoyed what I read there. Chapter 20 also had a little bit about a character named Tony Krause, whoever that is, experiencing heavy drug withdrawals. So coming back to a lot of drug and withdrawal and addiction related stuff. It was a very goofy section, but still fun, and also seems to relate to the chapter from earlier with the stolen artificial heart. I'm not entirely sure I put together how it relates. Like, maybe he was one of the crew that stole the heart. I can't really tell what's going on there. We'll see how it relates later, I guess, if this kind of stuff is relevant to the overall story. But you know, it was a goofy section that was a little bit strange to read, but it was what it was as well. Chapter 21 was a little bit of a longer one in a time when, you know, several of the chapters up to this point, like I said, are half great, but then half was like something that ran a little overlong or was a little dry or wasn't as interesting, harder to push through in some degree. Chapter 21 was like 100% great, despite being over 40 pages worth of reading, with most of that being a 20-page endnote. This chapter uses one of Hal's classes at ETA, plus someone that Oren met over a phone call. You know, they talked about this over a phone call. Someone Oren met to hint at a lot more stuff regarding separatism, something from an earlier phone call in this portion of the book that I read this month. Yet again, certain details about this phone call and about, you know, the separatism stuff was a little bit jumbled up, a little bit muddy, but what I got out of it was great. The large-scale political backdrop of the book just overall has been very interesting, especially as far as these phone calls have been concerned, because that's where a lot of it has come from. Some of it has come from the Mayor Steepley plotline, but a little bit of that has been a little bit more underlying, flying under the radar to some degree up to this point. I think within the call, there was a 20-page endnote, as I hinted at, of a different phone call between Hal and Oren. So, you know, a phone call within a phone call because of an endnote here. We learned several things within the endnote part of it. Oren doesn't seem to get along with Avril, their mother. Oren met a Helen, like I said, presumably Steepley from before, just as I mentioned from the last time we talked about this. There are uncertain references and background to the AFR and other separatist groups, which is something that they talked about over the phone before. There is also a lot of mentioning within this chapter and the endnote and all of that fun stuff about like convexity and concavity stuff in reference to like geography and territory between the United States and Canada that I just don't really understand. Like, maybe I'll come to understand that later, but like, as at the moment, it seems a little bit weird, and the word choice here is kind of odd, like convexity, concavity, how border territories and the sort of like political conflict between Canada and US, despite both being part of ONAN, is like, it's a really interesting bit of stuff. Like I said, the political backdrop of the book so far has been really great, really interesting, even if a lot of it doesn't really make much sense. This phone call also contained material that basically all of this material, I'll say, seem to relate to the Mayor Steepley plotline in ways that I'm excited to get into later, see how it all relates later, including the fact that Oren is being followed by folk in wheelchairs. He thinks he's being stalked by people in wheelchairs, so that directly relates to AFR stuff in ways that I'm kind of make me nervous for the future of his character and the book. But then there was also a couple other things about this chapter as well. There was a little 4-page segment of Meredith and Steepley within the chapter, sealing a little bit more of the political nature of the chapter overall. And then there was also, you know, you remember that Enfield Tennis Academy versus Port Washington Tennis Academy competition and Mario framing some shots with his hands or arms, however you want to define these. I say that for a very specific reason, because we got a scene within chapter 21 that completely recontextualizes that scene, and plus the like sort of sexual question mark encounter that Mario has earlier in the book. Apparently Mario is a very like deformed, improperly formed physically character, which made some of these past scenes viewed totally different and also kind of weird, but still interesting. Like, I'm looking forward to see how this physical deformity to some degree is like relevant to the story, but you know, it kind of, like I said, recontextualized the previous scenes that Mario is in, that is for sure. And then finally we come to chapter 22, the last chapter that I read over the past month. I'm surprised this video has been as short as it was after the first video was so long. I feared this one would be a lot longer than it's turned out to be. Either way, chapter 22, the last chapter that I read, had some pretty entertaining stuff. The first 1/3 of it in particular was Eschaton stuff, the crazy tennis game that Pemulus also helped to revolutionize within the book. A lot of this Eschaton stuff seemed, you know, irrelevant to the plot, and it seems like it basically was. There's something uncanny about the way that the match unraveled and went into chaos as it went on, but we'll see how any of that stuff might relate later, if any of it does. This section maybe was a tad bit overlong, but I also really enjoyed the nonsense. In fact, but to be honest, I would say I almost would have preferred this Eschaton section just be the whole chapter, or like be a little bit longer, but also not devolve into chaos. I would have just loved to read a little bit more of this BSing with this, you know, game within tennis of that helps kids to, you know, learn certain basics of tennis, like how to lob, you know, and whatever that means within tennis and all this other kind of stuff. The Eschaton section was fun. Maybe a little overlong, maybe a little dry to some people, but I enjoyed it a lot for what it was, even though I wish it didn't devolve into chaos, but maybe it devolving into chaos is important. The rest of the chapter was all Alcoholics Anonymous stuff, Ennett House stuff. Basically, we get revelations that Joel's here now at Ennett House, that there's an endnote within the chapter that confirms, like sort of confirms that Ellen, or that the Helen from Oren's phone calls with Hal, is the Helen Steeply. Like, there's no like actual confirmation, it's just like I'm putting pieces together. It feels like that has to be the case. A lot of this Ennett House stuff is hard to say like how it fits, but some portions were fun. Mostly a handful of extended stories of certain Alcoholics Anonymous members telling their stories with very dense back and forth prose that was really fun, but also took a really long time to read. Like I said, kind of hard to say for sure what's going on with the Ennett House stuff. It doesn't seem to be like fully relevant with other stuff. The fact that Joel's here now kind of means that like certain things are starting to come together, but like Ennett House is still kind of like a separate plot line that like it's just kind of out there at the moment. Even still, a lot of it seems to fly right over my head. So what do I think of what I've read? Well, there was a lot of stuff this week that flew over my head. There's plenty of it that was really dense and hard to really get a grip on, but there was also a lot of it that I really enjoyed. The truth is, I don't know how I feel about the book at this point now. The first, you know, 12% or whatever of the book that I read and covered in the first diary, basically the vast majority of that I really enjoyed. I would say out of what I read, the next like 28% or so of the book that I read over the last few weeks or the last month, I enjoyed a lot of it. I say maybe I enjoyed like 2/3 of it, and there was like 1/3 of it that was like pretty dry and hard to get through, hard to understand, but there was plenty of material that I also enjoyed. Stuff seems to be finally coming together, so maybe the next one of these diaries, which I've already titled by now, will be exactly what I've titled it. You know, Infinite Jest might be coming together now. We'll see as I read over the next month or so and get to the point of recording that diary. I'm hoping to get another big chunk of this read this month, but we'll kind of see what happens. Life has been kind of crazy, and after coming back from vacation, reading has been a whole heck of its own thing. I'm just recording this video the evening before it goes up, even though I plan to record it like a week or a week and a half ago. So that kind of says how things have been going for me the last couple of weeks. So yeah, that is that. I know I basically was just telling you what happened within the book, or my interpretation, what I think happened, basically what I remember happening within certain chapters. I'm glad that this video wasn't 2 hours long, because I feared that that was going to be the case. Hopefully I'm relaying my thoughts and my experience with what I've read from the book well enough. The truth is, I'm just waiting for things to make a tad bit more sense as a collective work to really say what I'm feeling about each individual piece. Like, there's a lot of stuff that I can say. I'm intrigued by this. I'm looking forward to see how this goes, or how these things kind of start to tie together as the book goes on. But like, things are barely starting to tie together in ways that are like actually starting to make sense. So we'll see how the next month goes, and you'll see what my experience was like in the next one of these diaries. I'm also learning that I need to take slightly more detailed notes upon my reading each time that I read any part of this book to help remember what I'm actually reading, because there's plenty of instances of like, I don't remember exactly what happened in this chapter, or I don't remember what exactly happened with this thing, this plot line that I mentioned. And you know, we'll see how that goes. Maybe this video was shorter because of the fact that I actually took really good notes and wasn't having to go through and find stuff. I consolidated the main points of my notes that I did take into a sheet like this, so I'm probably going to do that for the next few diaries as well. So we'll see how the next one of these goes. Sorry for what might have been a pretty poor video, but I am excited to continue the book. I'm excited to get to another one of these diaries in about a month or so, and I look forward to you joining along if you have been reading the book alongside me, or if you're reading shortly after me and just using these videos for reference, if you're one of my friends with the sort of read along that we have going, or if you're somebody who's read the book before or is just reading the book at some point, potentially years in the future. Like I said, sorry for a potentially bad video, but thank you for watching it. If you did, I'm excited to continue the book, and I hope you are excited to continue it with me. For now, the next one of these diaries will be in about a month, but on Tuesday I have a review coming for Anna Karenina, and next Thursday I have a review for a little bit of something different coming to the channel, and I hope to see you guys there.